13 minutes before the top of the hour. I'm Bill Martinez. Carl Gallups is with us. Longtime senior pastor, best-selling author, former Florida law enforcement officer, 10-year conservative talk radio host, author of the book, Be Thou Prepared. Carl, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, Bill. It's always an honor to be with you.
Well, I got to tell you, the honor is always mine. You're such a dear friend. I think back, Carl, when God brought us together, and it really was God's hand of providence in bringing us together. At the time, for me, I was based in the West Coast, even though we were a national entity, and you in the East there in Florida, and then eventually, I'm now bi-coastal these days, so I get a chance to come on your side of the land, occasionally. So I am just grateful for you, and I'm grateful for our friendship. It means a lot to me.
Well, and the same thing here, Bill. And we've been through a lot together, and I do see the hand of God in this. And what a great friend and brother you are. And thank you again for having me on the show today. These are exciting times in which we're living, brother.
Well, exactly. And, interestingly enough, we just talked with Pastor Mark Biltz, who was the vanguard of the, the revelation and the explanation of the four blood moons. And, and we look back on 2015, and there are warning signs, no doubt. And this is what, if nothing else, the four blood moons, brought to mind, is that we need to be aware of what's going on. When you look over the landscape and what we've just gone through in this past year, and you see the trajectory that this country, other nations around that they're on, what are you seeing for 2016? Relevant to your book, Be Thou Prepared. Your book, which was so excellent in the timing of it all on so many levels. I imagine if you wanted to address all the warnings, we'd have to do volumes on this, right?
Oh yeah. In fact, I've got another book coming out in the fall of this year, 2016, that basically does that. It addresses as many of the prophetic warning signs and prophetic markers that I know, and they're still unfolding before us. They're myriad. I mean, it's just coming like a flood. We're living in very prophetic times. And my take on this always, the book will be, and my teaching and preaching on this, I've been doing it for 3 decades now, is balanced and it's reasonable and it's rational. I'm not a hand wringer and a date setter, but I'm a student of the Word, and I'm a student of geopolitical events, as you are, and I understand how to kind of put these together and make some sense of biblical prophecy and what's really happening before us. But
exactly.
But Bill, here's what I would say. Let me alliterate my thoughts for just a quick second. Here's what I would say that we learned over we've learned this over the last decade, I would say, the last 7 or 8 years, particularly what we learned last year and what we had better learn as we turn the corner into this year. 3 things. I'm going to alliterate them. I think we learned last year, and I'll back all of this up. Number 1, pulpits matter. Number 2, presidential elections matter. Number 3, prophecy matters, and you better pay attention to it. Let me explain. Pulpits matter. Well, in my book, Be Thou Prepared, I have a whole section in there. You've read it. George Barna and all of his massive research and surveys and showing that the vast majority of America's conservative evangelical pulpits, the pastors admitted over several years of research and thousands of pastors interviewed, that they know that the Bible addresses these things that are happening in our day: abortion and gay marriage and Israel and anti-Semitism and Middle East and persecution. They said they admitted that the Bible addresses these things, but 93% of them said we never address them from our pulpits because we don't want to lose members. And so what does that mean, Bill? It means pulpits matter. And
exactly.
And our nation, one of the reasons it's on this rotting process, I'm convinced, is because the church is remaining silent. And if the pulpits don't proclaim the truth, how are the people going to know other than their own independent study? Because the government's not going to tell them. The media's not going to tell them. The entertainment industry's not going to tell them. Where are they going to hear it? And so if the pulpits are silent, then the pews become complacent and then the nation rots. And I think
Exactly.
we learned that over the last several years, and I think there's an awakening going on in the church. I pray there is, and I pray my book is a helpful part of it, and there are many other good resources besides that book. But
well, Carl, I want you to pause just on that topic in terms of pulpits mattering. The irony of this is that the very people that they need, that God is sending their way, the souls, his very creation that need help, and he's sending them to these churches and these pulpits, but because the pastors are afraid, they're not trusting in God, who really is in charge of that ministry. Ultimately, he is the CEO, and he is the author and finisher of being fruitful and multiplying. You reject God's way and God's economy in order to see things according to your own eyes, and you jeopardize your own growth and prosperity. And meanwhile, these souls are coming, looking for answers. As you say, they're crying out for answers. And where do they go? Do they go to the bar? Do they talk to them? Some do. But they think logically, like they did in 9/11. They storm the churches, and they go there, and the churches are irrelevant.
Yeah.
And so what do you have, right? So the very thing they need is the very thing they reject, which is, I find to be quite ironic. But that's what happens when you're not synced up with God.
Yes, no, absolutely, and that's my point. And a study of the Word of God and of history reveals that the Lord always blesses that nation whose God is the Lord. Well, how can a nation's God be the Lord if that Lord is not being proclaimed from the nation's pulpits? Because, again, the government's not going to do it. The entertainment industry is not. The evening news is not going to do it. So I am praying that 2016 sees more of America's pulpits come alive and come aflame with the fire of the passion of the Word of God.
That's
so
right.
that God's people will know how to practically apply the Word of God. That's another thing that my book does, Be Thou Prepared. It's a practical application, and it answers dozens of questions about how do we move through these prophetic times in which we're living. So pulpits matter. And the next thing is presidential elections matter. Listen, I am not saying that Barack Obama is the epitome of all evil and all of America's problems. We've been on a downward spiral for several administrations, but he's kind of the exclamation point on the end of the sentence as far as we've come.
Yeah, he is, hasn't he?
Yeah,
exactly.
Because think about it. I mean, just run down the list. He and Hillary Clinton literally took credit for starting Arab Spring. The New York Times has documented that Arab Spring is what led to ISIS. ISIS has led to a Middle East crisis chaos. It has led to the possibility of being on the edge of World War III, refugees by the millions, hundreds of thousands of refugees, Muslims coming into the United States. ISIS is among them and into Europe. Israel and the United States have some of the worst relations I've seen in my lifetime. Israel is threatened, surrounded by enemies now because of all of this. The Iran nuclear agreement is a disaster. The radical climate change agenda is a disaster. The radical gay marriage ruling and agenda under Obama is a disaster. It's rotting our nation, all of these issues, as well as putting the world at the edge of World War III. And this is what you and I screamed 8 years ago, 7 years ago.
Right,
Presidential elections matter. And what I hope the lesson that many Christians learned last year and over the last 6 or 7 years is that we had millions of Christians check out of the process. Bill, you and I talked about this. They didn't even register to vote, much less vote.
Only 50%. Only 50% vote, and of that 50% register, and of that 50 that register, 50% of those actually go to the polls.
Yeah, and that's my point. Presidential elections matter, but if you've checked out of the process, if you're not being the salt and the light that Jesus, listen, folks, commanded us to be, and God has handed us the gift of America, the greatest Christian nation, the biggest Christian nation, the most benevolent nation, the most powerful nation, the most affluent nation the globe has ever seen in human history. God has given it to us, and of all people, Christians are sitting back and they're checking out.
That's right.
They don't understand presidential elections matter. I pray we learned that last year. I pray as we go into this year, which is a presidential election year, we will think about ISIS and Arab Spring and Middle East and refugees and Israel and Iran and radical climate change and gay marriage rulings. I mean, all of that came out of this presidential election of the man that's in there now. And
Carl,
then,
about 30 seconds left. Let's hit Prophecy Matters, and I'm sorry, it's
okay.
typical of you and I, but let's go ahead and let's hit Prophecy.
Yeah, Prophecy Matters. China is in the Middle East. Russia's in the Middle East. Syria and Turkey and Iran are major players with China and Russia. The Bible speaks of all of that. We're living in prophetic times.
And we need to keep our eyes on Israel, because that's still, I say, the hour hand of God's prophetic clock. The rest is all minutes and seconds. It is passing by lickety-split, moving at warp speeds, shall we say, right?
Yes, absolutely. And Israel is surrounded by enemies on all sides, which is another prophetic sign.
Carl, as always, you are a blessing.